The first sound was not gunfire. It was sirens, long trembling howls rising over the rooftops of Warsaw, a sound no one had ever heard before, but everyone instantly understood. Mothers pulled children from their beds. Men froze in doorways with unlit cigarettes between their fingers. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath. At 4:40 a.m., the first German bombs fell. The night sky split open in flashes of white. The windows of Aleje Jerozolimsky rattled like teeth. A tram, its route half finished, lay on its side by the station, metal screaming as sparks rained down its length. Somewhere near the Vistula, a dog barked and didn't stop. Captain Jan Kowalski of the Polish 10th Mechanized Brigade stood in the street, boots half-laced, watching the orange glow spreading along the horizon. He'd been awake for 2 nights, listening to radio fragments that spoke in codes, unconfirmed aggression, mobilization orders, cease all civilian movement east of Lodz. Now there was no code left, only the unmistakable hum of Luftwaffe engines rolling over the city. "Sir!" a young private shouted from the stairwell behind him. "The radio says Westerplatte under attack. They hit the barracks at dawn." Jan turned. His face was expressionless. "At dawn?" The boy nodded. "It's begun, sir." The captain picked up his rifle from the floor, slung it over his shoulder, and said quietly, "Then we're already late." In a flat across the street, a woman was dragging a suitcase toward the door. Her husband, still in his undershirt, held their daughter's hand. The child asked why the church bells were ringing if it wasn't Sunday. He didn't answer. Outside, sirens drowned the city's heartbeat. The first wave of Stukas appeared over Warsaw like black crosses carved into the sky. Their dive sirens, those mechanical screams built to terrify, turned the air into chaos. Bombs fell in perfect German rhythm, 1 every 8 seconds. At the Saxon Gardens, statues that had watched over generations toppled. Dust swallowed everything: streets, faces, prayers. By 7 a.m., the Polish radio announced what everyone already knew. Germany had invaded without a declaration. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was no longer just a word whispered in cafes. It was here, slamming into the heart of Poland. Jan's unit rolled out of Warsaw by noon, the treads of their small tankettes cutting through cobblestones slick with dust and oil. Behind them, the city still burned. The men said little. The private with freckles hummed a tune his mother used to sing while peeling potatoes. Someone else coughed and didn't stop. Every kilometer east felt like moving backwards through time. Fields, farms, frightened faces. A boy waved a Polish flag at the roadside until his father yanked him inside. Near Radom, they stopped beside a broken radio tower. Jan climbed the ladder halfway, scanning the distance with his binoculars. Columns of smoke on the horizon. Convoys of refugees clogged the roads like veins, and above them all, silver shapes moving in formation, too high to hear, too perfect to stop. He whispered, "They're not just bombing cities, they're erasing them." A corporal handed him a crumpled message, intercepted on the field line. "Britain and France to deliver ultimatum." Jan read it twice. Ultimatum. It was a word that had meant hope once. Now it meant delay. He knew what it meant for them on the ground. They'd fight alone, at least for now. As dusk fell, his column reached the village of Piaseczno. Children peered from barns. The priest stood in the road holding a wooden cross like it could stop tanks. Jan ordered the men to rest. "Eat something," he said. "We move again at midnight." Someone muttered, "Move where, Captain? The whole sky's falling." Jan didn't answer. He looked west, toward Warsaw, toward the fires, and felt the ground shake beneath his boots. A second later, he heard it. Engines, dozens of them. He looked up. A formation of bombers was crossing the moonlit sky, heading east, toward them, and this time there would be no warning sirens. The first bomb hit the orchard. The blast tore through the trees, scattering apples and branches across the road like shrapnel. Then came the second, closer, heavier, shaking the ground so hard that the men dropped flat before they could think. Dirt and smoke rolled through the night air. Horses screamed in their trailers. A tankette caught fire, its fuel igniting with a roar that turned the road into a tunnel of orange light. "Spread out," Jan shouted. "Get away from the road." The men scattered into the fields, diving behind haystacks and ditches. The grass was wet and smelled of diesel. Overhead, the bombers moved in disciplined lines, black shadows crossing the moon. Every few seconds, a flash, then thunder. The private with freckles was crawling toward a fallen telegraph pole, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't unclip his helmet strap. "Captain," he yelled, "they're hitting everything. Doesn't matter if it's soldiers or civs." "They want panic," Jan said, crawling beside him. "That's the point." A farmhouse caught fire behind them, its roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. The family that had been standing in the doorway moments ago was gone. Only the echo of their screams remained, drowned by the roar of the engines. For a few seconds, everything was light, a burning horizon. Then the bombs stopped. Silence fell like snowfall. Only the crackle of flames and the faraway buzz of retreating planes. The men lifted their heads, blinking through the smoke. "They're heading north," the corporal said, wiping soot from his face. "Warsaw," Jan muttered. "They're going back for another run." He rose slowly, brushing dirt from his uniform. The air tasted of metal and ash. He could feel the vibration of distant tanks through his boots, German armor moving fast. "Get the radio working," he ordered. "We need orders from command." But the radio was gone, smashed in the blast. They were deaf. For a moment, Jan stood still, listening to the night. The whimper of wounded men, the hiss of burning fuel, the strange, hollow quiet after catastrophe. He thought of his wife, Helena, in Krakow. Her last letter, dated August 28th, still folded in his breast pocket. "If it comes, promise you'll come back. Promise you'll find me." He'd promised, but already the world was shifting too fast for promises. By morning, the column regrouped. Fewer trucks, fewer faces. The corporal counted 38 men left. "Out of 62, he said flatly. Jan nodded. "Then we move with 38. They moved southeast, staying off main roads, cutting through forests and villages where windows were nailed shut and wells ran dry. Everywhere, rumors spread faster than the soldiers. Germans in Krakow, Germans in Łódź, the Russians, maybe coming from the east. No one knew what was true anymore. At noon, they stopped by a small chapel half buried in dust. Inside, a priest was packing statues into a crate. He looked up as they entered, his eyes wide but steady. "You're the last," he said quietly. "Everyone else already passed through. South, toward the mountains." "The army?" Jan asked. The priest shook his head. "Families, soldiers don't pass anymore." Jan removed his cap. "We're not finished yet." The priest smiled sadly. "Then you're the only ones who believe that." Outside, the men refueled from a jerry can. The private with freckles stared at a child's toy lying in the dust, a wooden plane with one wing missing. "They said France would help," he murmured. "They will," Jan said automatically. "Just not today." He didn't sound like he believed it. As night fell again, the horizon flickered red, the direction of Łódź. Jan's men watched in silence. One whispered, "That's not firelight. That's a whole city burning." Jan didn't reply. He just watched, jaw tight, the reflection dancing in his eyes. Then, through the static of their backup field radio, a voice crackled to life, faint but unmistakable. "Britain and France have declared war on Germany." The men froze. War had spread beyond Poland. But to Jan, the question hit harder than any bomb. Would help come in time, or only after his country was gone? The message repeated twice before the radio cut out, a trembling signal bouncing through the static. "Britain and France have declared war on Germany." For a heartbeat, the men stared at each other. Then came a low murmur, half relief, half disbelief. "They did it," one whispered. "They actually did it." Someone laughed, a small cracked sound in the smoke. But Jan didn't. He just looked at the broken antenna jutting out of the truck roof and said, "Then may God help us all." He knew what it meant. Words first, action later. Wars start with announcements. They're won or lost by the ones who bleed before the reinforcements arrive. The following morning, rain swept over the fields. cooling the fires, but not the fear. Jan's unit moved south toward Tomaszów-Mazowiecki, where the 10th Mechanized Brigade was regrouping. Every mile brought more refugees, carts piled with furniture, women clutching infants, old men leading cows through the mud. The roads were rivers of exhaustion. Children stared at the soldiers like ghosts. Some waved, some just watched, eyes too hollow for their age. By noon, they reached the outskirts of a small town reduced to ruins. The post office was gone. The church roof caved in. An old man sat beside a well, his face covered in soot, holding a teacup that had survived when everything else hadn't. He looked up at them and said, "They came at dawn, left nothing." Jan gave him his last cigarette. "They'll come again," he said softly. The man nodded. "Then you'll die here with us." Jan didn't answer. The brigade had been cut in half. Major Zygmunt Matzek's orders were clear. Delay the German advance toward Krakow at all costs. The enemy's panzers were fast, ruthless, and far better equipped. But Poland had its mountains, its forests, its stubbornness. That night, rain turned the dirt to clay. Jan crouched beside his tankette, running an oil rag along the barrel, listening to the distant thunder of artillery echoing through the valley. The corporal approached, coat soaked, voice low. "They say the Germans have crossed the Bzura. We'll be surrounded by morning." Jan kept cleaning. "Then we move before morning." "Where to?" "South. We'll link up with Matzek if he's still holding the line." The corporal hesitated. "And if he's not?" Jan looked up. "If he's not," he said, "we keep fighting anyway." When dawn came, the rain stopped, replaced by fog thick as milk. The air was cold enough to bite. Engines rumbled to life, muffled under tops. The small Polish column rolled forward through the mist. For hours, nothing. Just fog, trees, the hum of machinery. Then, a sound. At first it was faint. A low drone, then louder, closer. Engines, again, but deeper, heavier. Jan raised his binoculars. Shapes emerged through the haze. Silhouettes of armor. But they weren't Polish. "Panzers," the corporal whispered. Jan's pulse quickened. "Positions, flank left, use the tree line." The men scrambled, dragging rifles through the mud, their breath white in the cold. Moments later, machine guns opened up, the sound splitting the fog like ripping cloth. Bullets shredded branches overhead. A shell landed 10 meters away, tossing soil into the air. The private with freckles fell backward, clutching his ear, blood running through his fingers. Jan ducked behind a tree, shouting over the chaos, "Fire in pairs! Wait for my mark!" His voice was almost lost in the roar. The first anti-tank round hit a panzer's track, sending sparks flying. It didn't stop it, but it slowed. Then another, and another. Smoke filled the tree line. The Polish guns were smaller, weaker, but precise. Every man fired like the next bullet could buy one more breath. Jan felt the vibration of his own gun through his chest. He fired, reloaded, fired again. Through the fog, he saw one German tank burning. The crew climbed out, flames chasing them like shadows. For a brief moment, it felt like victory. Then the second wave came, larger, faster, supported by armored cars. The ground shook with their advance. "Fall back!" Jan shouted. "To the ridge!" They ran, through mud, smoke, and branches, tearing at their sleeves. By dusk, half of them were gone. Jan reached the ridge, panting, his uniform streaked with dirt and blood. Below, the valley burned. He counted 10 tanks, maybe more. The corporal crawled beside him. "We can't stop them, sir." "I know. So what do we do?" Jan looked down at the burning horizon. "Delay them," he said. "Make them think we're still an army." That night, they planted charges on the bridge ahead, the only road leading east. Jan lit the fuse himself. As the flame hissed down the cord, he whispered, "For every day we hold them, maybe someone else lives." The explosion lit the sky, and somewhere far away, the German advance slowed. For one night. The bridge collapsed into the river like a dying animal, its spine snapping, its breath turned to smoke. The explosion rolled through the valley, echoing off the hills, bouncing back on itself until it sounded less like war and more like the earth crying out. The men cheered weakly. For a few seconds, the noise made them feel human again. But when the echoes faded, they were alone. No response fire, no orders, no backup. Jan looked at the burning remains. "That's one less road they can use," he said quietly. The corporal, sitting beside a destroyed truck, rubbed mud between his fingers. "They'll just build another." "I know." "Then why?" "Because it buys us time," Jan cut in. "Time is all we have left." The fog thickened again as they moved east, following dirt tracks through farmland that was already half destroyed. In every village, the same scene repeated. Carts abandoned mid-road, doors hanging open, bread still on tables. People had run so fast they left their lives half-lived. By noon, the rain returned, slow, heavy drops that flattened the smoke and turned the fields to a gray ocean of mud. The sound of distant artillery came like thunder from the west. Jan's men trudged through the muck, rifles over their shoulders, the barrels wrapped in rags. A few sang quietly, old songs from before the war, when the army was still a rumor and not a sentence. The private with freckles limped, his ear bandaged, face pale. "How far, Captain?" he asked. "Until we find the others." "And if there are no others?" "Then we make them think there are." The road curved past a forest clearing, where 3 wagons were overturned, horses lying still in the mud. A woman's shawl fluttered from a wheel spoke. The corporal looked away. "They don't even bury them now." Jan didn't reply. He just kept walking. By late afternoon, they reached a railway line. A train had derailed nearby, its cars torn open, cargo scattered. Flour mixed with rain, turning the ground white like snowfall. A soldier climbed one of the wagons and shouted, "Food!" The men rushed over. Sacks of grain, some canned meat, bottles still intact. For the first time in days, they ate until they couldn't move. Jan stood apart, watching the horizon. The silence after hunger was worse than the hunger itself. He knew comfort never lasted long in war. He was right. The radio operator approached, wiping his hands. "We picked up chatter again. German frequency. Something about a push east. Names I didn't recognize." Jan took the headset. Static hissed, then a clipped voice. "Lublin. Armored group advancing. No organized resistance reported." Lublin. That was where the last major Polish formations were meant to regroup. If the Germans reached it first, there would be nothing left to defend. He looked at his men, 30 faces streaked with mud, too tired to stand, too proud to quit. They needed direction, they needed purpose. "Listen up," he said, climbing onto the wagon. "We're heading for Lublin. There's a command post there, maybe reinforcements, maybe not, but it's the only line left between them and the border." No one cheered. They just nodded. That was enough. They moved through the night again. Headlights covered, boots sinking into mud that pulled at their ankles. Jan walked at the front, compass in hand, following the faint glow of the North Star through the clouds. Every sound felt sharper now. Every rustle, every gust of wind, like a whisper from the dark. Around midnight, they passed a burned-out farmhouse. Inside, the remnants of dinner still sat on the table. A single candle flickered beside a picture of a young man in uniform. Jan stared at it for a moment before blowing out the flame. "We can't let them see the light," he said, and see the... They reached a crossroads just before dawn. To the west, the thunder of approaching armor. To the east, silence. And Lublin. Jan raised his hand. "Down," he whispered. They crouched low as a convoy of German trucks rolled by less than 100 meters away, headlights glowing through the fog. The sound of engines vibrated through the soil. No one breathed. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A spotlight swept across the field. Paused, then moved on. The convoy passed. The men exhaled slowly. Jan's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of keeping it buried. He looked east again. The horizon was beginning to glow pink. "Move," he said. "We can make it by nightfall." But when they reached the next village, there were no soldiers, no civilians, only burned houses and a German flag hanging from the church tower. And nailed to the door was a message, scrawled in Polish. "The war is lost. Lay down your arms." Jan tore it down, his fingers trembling. Then he looked at the men and said, "Not yet." They entered the village like ghosts, weapons drawn, boots silent against the ash. The smell hit first, burnt wood, wet earth, and something sour beneath it. The air had the heaviness of a place that remembered violence. No birds, no dogs, just wind through hollow doorways. Jan motioned 2 soldiers toward the houses on the left. The corporal took the right. They checked door by door. Nothing. Only overturned chairs, broken plates, letters scattered across floors that no one would read again. The private with freckles stopped at a table. There was a loaf of bread there, still soft. He looked at Jan. "They were here yesterday." Jan nodded. "And the Germans this morning." They found the flag inside the church tower, red, white, and black. Freshly hung, not yet faded by rain. Jan pulled it down himself, folding it tight before tossing it into the mud. The corporal looked at him. "Sir, what's the point? They'll just hang another." Jan stared at the empty altar. "Then we'll take that one down, too." Outside, the wind picked up. The sound of engines echoed faintly, distant but approaching. Jan's pulse quickened. "We can't stay here." They left the village, moving through the back roads, keeping the tree line close. The land around them was changing. Less farmland now, more forest, heavy with autumn leaves. The sky had that strange, bruised color that comes before a storm. By dusk, they reached a stream. Jan knelt and filled his canteen, watching the ripples. The water was cold enough to numb his fingers. The corporal crouched beside him. "You ever think they'll stop, sir? The Germans?" Jan shook his head. "Not until someone makes them." "And who's going to do that?" He didn't answer. That night they camped beneath a stand of birches. The rain came back, soft, steady, endless. The men huddled beneath tarps, whispering in low voices. Stories about home, mothers, wives. One soldier confessed he'd never actually fired his rifle at a man yet. "I can shoot a target," he said, "but not a face." No one judged him. Everyone understood. Jan sat apart, scribbling notes in a small book. Troop numbers, coordinates, rumors of other units. It was habit now, even though he knew no one might ever read it. The corporal approached quietly. "You should sleep." Jan shook his head. "If I sleep, I'll see them again." "Who?" "The ones we left in Radom." The corporal didn't push. He just sat there, silent, until Jan finally closed the notebook. At dawn, they started moving again. The sky was pale gray, the kind that hides everything. Mercy, hope, direction. They reached the outskirts of another town by mid-morning, Lublin at last, or what was left of it. The city was chaos. Smoke rose from factories, sirens wailed somewhere beyond the river, and civilians ran through the streets carrying whatever they could. German artillery pounded from the west, every shell landing with a flat, sick sound. Jan's heart sank. He'd imagined a command post, orders, resistance. Instead, there was only retreat. A Polish officer waved them down at the crossroads. His face was streaked with soot, his uniform torn. "You're late," he shouted over the noise. "Everything's collapsing. The line's gone." Jan dismounted, gripping his shoulder. "Where's the command?" "There is no command. Warsaw's fallen. Radio's dead. The Soviets are moving from the east now." The words hit like another explosion. Jan blinked. "The Soviets?" "Yes," the officer said bitterly. "Your friends. They've come to liberate us." The sky above them roared. Not German bombers this time, but the same sound, the same fear. Jan stared up at the clouds. "Then it's over," he whispered. "No," the officer said. "It's just beginning." The next shell landed a block away, sending both men sprawling into the mud. Jan pushed himself up, ears ringing. "Get your men east," he shouted to the corporal. "We can't hold the city." They ran, past burning trucks, through streets littered with glass and bodies. A school collapsed behind them, windows bursting outward in a shower of fire and dust. When they reached the bridge out of Lublin, Jan stopped. The road beyond was filled with civilians, all heading the same direction, east, toward nothing. A woman carrying a baby looked at him as she passed. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. "Where do we go?" she asked. Jan couldn't answer. He watched her disappear into the smoke. Behind him, the corporal shouted, "Sir, look!" Jan turned. Across the river, new flags were rising, red ones, with hammers and sickles. The Germans from the west, the Soviets from the east. Poland was being swallowed whole, and Jan realized this war wasn't just lost, it was about to be erased. The wind carried the sound of two armies closing in, engines from the west and the low mechanical grind of treads from the east. For the first time, Jan couldn't tell which was worse. Smoke clung to the riverbanks like fog. Bridges burned at both ends, filling the air with the metallic smell of wet ash. Civilians were trapped between them, crowds of thousands pushing east, west, anywhere that wasn't here. Children cried, horses reared, a man shouted that his wife had fallen behind and vanished in the chaos. Jan's men stood in the middle of the road, their uniforms streaked with soot, watching helplessly as history crushed them from both sides. The corporal pointed toward the eastern horizon. "Are we fighting the Soviets now?" Jan's answer came slowly. "If they shoot at us, yes." They turned off the main road, cutting through orchards and farmland. The rumble of approaching tanks grew louder, closer. The trees shook with every shell fired miles away. By dusk, they reached a small hill overlooking the town. Fires flickered below like candles burning at the world's funeral. The Polish flag above the city hall hung in tatters, blackened at the edges. Jan's men were exhausted. The private with freckles had stopped talking altogether. His hands trembled whenever planes passed overhead. "Sir," the corporal said, voice hoarse, "the men can't keep going like this. We haven't slept more than an hour in 3 days." Jan nodded. "We rest here tonight." They found an abandoned barn halfway down the hill. Inside, straw was scattered, half burned, still smelling faintly of smoke and animals long gone. The men collapsed into the corners, boots still on, rifles leaning against the wall. Jan sat near the open doorway, watching the embers of Lublin burn in the distance. He could hear faint music somewhere, maybe a phonograph from a house that hadn't been hit yet. A love song, absurdly calm against the thunder of war. The corporal approached quietly. "What happens now?" Jan didn't look up. "We wait for orders." "From who?" He hesitated. "Whoever's still standing." They both knew that might be no one. The night dragged on. Rain fell through holes in the roof, tapping against helmets like clock hands marking the end of something. In the early hours, the silence broke, the sound of engines nearby and voices speaking Russian. Jan raised a hand. "Out the back," he whispered. The men slipped through the barn's rear door into the wet field behind it. They crouched low, moving along the hedgerow until they could see the road. A column of Soviet tanks was rolling through the mud, headlights off, silhouettes dark and hulking against the burning sky. Soldiers walked beside them, Red Army uniforms, rifles slung casually, faces unreadable. The Polish corporal cursed under his breath. "So it's true." Jan watched as one of the Soviet officers dismounted, shouting orders. The Russians weren't here to help, they were claiming territory, and whoever stood in the way was the enemy. He clenched his jaw. "We move south. There's still resistance near the Hungarian border. If we can reach them, maybe we can regroup." The men followed, silent, slipping between trees and ruins, staying clear of roads. The rain covered their tracks. By dawn, they were miles away. The landscape had changed. Rolling hills, fewer villages, more wilderness. The world felt emptier here, quieter, like even the birds had fled. They passed a column of refugees heading north, Farmers, priests, children walking barefoot through the mud. One of them stopped Jan, grabbing his sleeve. "Is it true?" the man asked. "They say the Germans and Russians are shaking hands." Jan looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Yes," he said softly. "It's true." The man nodded once, eyes hollow. "Then God help us all." They reached the ruins of another bridge that afternoon. German and Soviet soldiers were already on opposite sides of the river, waving to each other, exchanging cigarettes. Jan's men watched from the trees, stunned. The corporal spat into the dirt. So this was the plan all along. Jan said nothing. His face was stone. Inside, though, something broke. A small, silent collapse that no one else could see. He turned to his men. "We keep moving, south, until we hit the border." The road ahead was long, narrow, and lined with the skeletons of burned vehicles. But it was still a road. And that meant it led somewhere. That night, as they camped beneath the open sky, the private with freckles whispered, "Sir, if Poland's gone, what are we fighting for now?" Jan didn't answer right away. Then, staring at the stars that the war hadn't yet stolen, he said quietly, "For memory, so they can't pretend we never existed." The road south was mud and silence. Every few kilometers they passed the remains of something once alive, a wagon half buried in ash, a field cratered with unexploded shells, a farmhouse still smoldering from a raid hours before. The countryside looked like it had been erased, redrawn in smoke and ruin. Jan's men spoke less now. Even the corporal, who had once filled the march with small jokes and radio fragments, was quiet. The private with freckles walked in the rear, one hand on his bandaged ear, humming tunelessly to himself, a sound just loud enough to keep from hearing the world fall apart. They reached the outskirts of a forest by dusk. Jan raised a hand for silence. Ahead, the faint flicker of firelight through the trees. Movement. Voices. He crouched, signaling the corporal forward. They advanced through the underbrush, rifles ready. When they broke through the clearing, they froze. Not Germans. Polish uniforms. Dirt-stained, exhausted, but Polish. A dozen men sat around a small fire, rifles stacked nearby. Their officer looked up, his eyes wary, then softened as he saw the eagle insignia on Jan's cap. "You're with the 10th?" he asked. "Was," Jan said. "What's left of it?" The man nodded. "Same for us. 41st Infantry. We've been scattered since Raidham." The two groups merged around the fire, sharing what little food they had. Hard bread, tinned meat, water that tasted like metal. It felt almost normal, almost human. The new officer, Captain Nowak, unrolled a damp map. "We're heading south, too. Rumor is the government's evacuating to Romania. If we can reach the border, we might link up." Jan traced a finger along the map. "That's 200 kilometers through occupied territory." Nowak smiled grimly. "Then we'd better start walking." The men slept in shifts. Jan didn't sleep at all. He sat awake by the dying fire, staring into the coals. Every sound in the forest felt magnified, branches cracking, owls calling, wind rustling through leaves. Each one sounded like footsteps. In the middle of the night, a shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. Jan rose silently, rifle in hand, motioning for the others to stay down. The figure stepped into view. A boy, maybe 17, barefoot and shivering. He raised his hands. "Don't shoot, please!" Jan lowered his weapon slightly. "Who are you?" "Messenger," the boy stammered. "From Lwów. I've been running for 2 days. The Soviets. They've taken the city." The men stirred awake at the words. Jan's stomach turned cold. "Lwów?" The boy nodded, trembling. "They're rounding up officers. Anyone with rank. They say it's for questioning. But people disappear." Nowak cursed under his breath. So the Russians aren't allies after all. Jan shook his head. No, they never were. They let the boy eat, then sent him to rest near the fire. He was asleep within minutes, face pressed against his arm. Jan looked at him, a child carrying news of the world's betrayal. and felt a strange ache in his chest. How many messengers would never make it home? At dawn, they broke camp. The forest was still and wet, the mist hanging low. They moved south, two groups merged into one, following faint trails that twisted through the pines. By midday, they found an abandoned farmhouse, its door blown inward, dishes still on the table. Jan ordered the men to rest. Inside, he found a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. For the first time in weeks, he saw his own reflection, gaunt, hollow-eyed, streaked with grime. He barely recognized himself. Captain Jan Kowalski, the man who once believed in discipline, order, maps, now looked like one more fugitive in a dying country. He splashed his face with cold water from a bucket. The reflection wavered, then steadied. Behind him, the corporal leaned against the doorway. "Sir, scouts say there's a German patrol ahead, about 15 men. They've set up camp by the river crossing." Jan dried his face, eyes sharp again. "Then we go around," the corporal hesitated, "or we take them." "Why?" "They have supplies, and radios." Jan looked out the window. The men were tired, hungry, and carrying rifles with barely a magazine each. But he knew the corporal was right. They couldn't keep running on scraps. He nodded. "Fine. Tonight. No mistakes." That evening, the forest filled with the metallic click of preparation, bolts sliding, safeties snapping off. The men moved through the trees like shadows. They reached the riverbank just as the last light faded. Across the water, the German camp glowed faintly. Tents, a small fire, guards pacing lazily. Jan gave the signal. The first shot cracked the stillness, then another, then chaos. The Germans scrambled, shouting, their rifles flashing in the dark. Jan's men moved fast, coordinated, short bursts, then silence. Within minutes, it was over. Smoke drifted across the water. The men searched the camp. Food, ammunition, even a working radio. The corporal grinned, holding up a tin of coffee. "It's like Christmas, sir." Jan didn't smile. He was staring at the horizon, at a faint red glow to the north. "Warsaw," he said quietly. "They're burning what's left." The radio crackled. A German transmission caught mid-sentence. "All Polish resistance to be treated as unlawful combatants. Execute officers on sight." Jan's eyes darkened. "They're not fighting soldiers anymore," he said. "They're hunting them." And for the first time, the men understood. Survival was no longer the goal. It was defiance. The men buried the German bodies before dawn, not out of mercy, out of necessity. The smell of blood carried, and so did curiosity. Curiosity in this war got you killed. Jan stood by the riverbank, watching the fog rise off the water. The current was slow, oily with fuel. It mirrored the sky, gray, streaked with smoke trails that never faded. He had coffee in his hand, black and bitter. The corporal joined him, wrapping his coat tighter. 2 days' rations, he said. "Maybe 3 if we stretch it." Jan nodded. "Good. We'll need every hour." Behind them, the men moved quietly, repairing boots, checking weapons, eating in silence. The air carried that heavy stillness of men who had seen too much and said too little. The private with freckles stared at his reflection in the river. "Feels wrong," he murmured, "taking food off dead men." The corporal smirked without warmth. Better than starving beside them. Jan said nothing. His gaze was fixed south, where the hills rose faintly through the mist, the direction of the border. Beyond those hills lay Hungary. Beyond Hungary, maybe survival. He finished his coffee and crushed the tin in his hand. "We move again at noon," he said. They marched through the woods, single file, following an old hunting path that curved along the river. The trees were close enough to hide in, but sparse enough to feel exposed. Every sound, every snapping twig, made hearts jump. By mid-afternoon, the path opened into a meadow. Smoke drifted from the far side, thin, steady, unnatural. Jan crouched, signaling the others to stop. The corporal crawled forward beside him. "Another German patrol?" "Could be, or worse." They advanced low through the grass, eyes scanning for movement. As they neared the smoke, the scene came into focus. Not soldiers, villagers. A cluster of families, maybe 20 people, gathered around the remains of a farmhouse. They were burning documents, furniture, anything marked with an eagle or a flag. A woman spotted them first, clutching her child tight. Jan stepped forward, hands open. "Polish army," he said softly. "We're not here to harm you." An old man approached, his face lined and hollow. "Army?" he said bitterly. "Where's the rest of it, then?" Jan didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence spoke for him. The villagers offered them food, bread, onions, water, meager gifts from people who had less than nothing. In return, Jan shared what little they had scavenged from the German camp. Over the small fire, the old man told them what had happened. "The Germans passed through 3 days ago," he said. "Took the young men. Said they were volunteers. The Soviets came the day after. Took the rest." "The rest?" Jan asked quietly. "Teachers, priests, officers." He stared into the flames. "They said Poland doesn't exist anymore." The words hung heavy in the air. Even the fire seemed to dim. The corporal whispered, "If there's no Poland, what are we?" Jan didn't look up. "Remnants." That night they stayed in the ruins. Rain drummed against the broken roof. Jan lay awake, watching shadows move across the ceiling. Every thunderclap sounded like distant artillery. At some point, the private with freckles sat up, whispering, "Captain, you think the British will come? Like they promised?" Jan's voice was quiet. "They'll come when the smoke clears and there's something left to save." The boy's face fell. "Then they'll never come." Jan said nothing, because deep down he agreed. At dawn they moved again, through fog, through hunger, through silence. The landscape grew rougher, hillier, the trees thinning into rock and grass. Every kilometer felt heavier than the last. By noon they saw it, the border valley. Hungary lay beyond the ridge, still neutral, still uninvaded. Freedom was less than 5 miles away, but freedom in this war always came at a cost. Halfway down the slope they spotted movement, German trucks on the opposite hill moving in parallel. The corporal cursed. "They're sweeping the valleys." Jan raised his binoculars. Black crosses painted on the doors. Dozens of them. He scanned the horizon. "We'll never outrun them in the open." The forest line ended here. The only cover was a narrow ravine cutting through the rocks. He turned to his men. "Through there! Keep low! Move fast!" They ran, boots slipping on mud, rifles clutched tight. Shots rang out from the ridge. Bullets sliced the air, snapping twigs and soil. "Go! Go!" Jan shouted. The men dove into the ravine, panting, sliding between boulders slick with rain. The gunfire grew louder. Dirt exploded around them. The private stumbled, crying out, a bullet grazing his leg. The corporal grabbed him, hauling him up by the belt. "Keep moving!" They reached a bend in the ravine, a sharp turn that hid them from the ridge. The shooting stopped, replaced by distant shouting in German. The men pressed against the walls, gasping for breath. Jan looked at the corporal. "We have to split, small groups. They'll be searching." The corporal hesitated. "If we split, we might not find each other again." Jan met his eyes. "Then make sure they find you last." The men nodded, tired, terrified, but ready. Jan took one last look toward the ridge. The sky was red again, not from dawn this time, but from something burning behind them. As they moved deeper into the ravine, the private stumbled to a stop, pointing ahead. There, half buried in the mud, was a Polish officer's cap, fresh, clean, impossible, and beside it, a footprint, not German, Soviet. Someone else had made it this far and didn't make it out. The cap lay face down in the mud, the silver eagle glinting faintly beneath a thin film of rainwater. Jan crouched, brushing off the dirt. The insignia was Polish Army, same regiment, same year. The initials stitched inside the lining read LK. He froze. Only one man he knew signed his gear like that, Lieutenant Leon Krawczyk, his oldest friend. Jan's throat tightened. "He was here," he whispered. The corporal glanced over his shoulder. "You're sure?" Jan nodded. "I'd bet my life on it." They scanned the ravine, boot prints everywhere, half washed out by rain, some small, some heavy. Then the corporal pointed at a darker patch of mud ahead. Blood. They followed the trail, crimson spots fading into the stones, leading around a bend. The sound of wind filled the narrow canyon, whistling through cracks like whispers. Then they saw it, a broken tree trunk splintered at the base, and beyond it, a shallow grave. Rocks piled hastily, rifle bayonets sticking out like markers. The corporal crossed himself. God. Jan knelt, fingers tracing the mud-stained helmet resting on top. He didn't move for a long time. The men watched in silence, their breaths shallow. Finally, he stood. "We bury it properly," he said. "He was one of us." They worked quietly, moving stones, flattening the earth. No words, no prayer, just the sound of rain and shovels. When it was done, Jan stood over the mound, staring at the soil until his vision blurred. The corporal touched his shoulder. "We should go, sir." Jan nodded. "He made it this far, so will we." They moved on through the ravine, the ground turning steeper, narrower, and slick with moss. The rock walls seemed to close in, pressing the air from their lungs. Every noise sounded like pursuit, every echo a phantom of boots behind them. After 2 hours, they reached an opening, a gap between cliffs overlooking the valley below. The Hungarian border lay less than a kilometer ahead. Freedom. But the valley wasn't empty. Down below, German patrols moved like ants across the slopes. Armored cars, dogs, flares. They were combing the terrain, sweeping east to west. The corporal cursed softly. "They're blocking the pass." Jan scanned the terrain. The only alternate route was higher, a ridge that curved along the cliffside, half crumbled but still climbable. He looked at his men, tired, half-starved, wounded, and made the decision. "We climb." The ridge was brutal. Loose shale, icy wind, and cliffs that fell straight into darkness. One wrong step meant falling into oblivion. But they climbed anyway, hands bleeding, boots scraping, breath fogging in the cold. Halfway up, the private slipped. Jan caught his arm just in time, hauling him back against the rock. "Don't look down," he said. "I wasn't," the boy gasped. "I was looking up." Jan glanced above, a hawk circling against the gray sky. Even the birds were free. They reached the ridge crest by dusk. The sun was low, red through the haze. From here they could see the valley stretch out in both directions, a tapestry of ruin. Smoke columns marked towns they'd never reach. The corporal dropped beside him, panting. "We can make the border by nightfall." Jan nodded. "We move once it's dark." As night fell, they descended toward the valley floor, sticking close to shadows. The German patrols were thinning now, heading west, chasing rumors of resistance that no longer existed. By midnight, the last kilometer was ahead, a shallow stream marking the invisible line between Poland and Hungary. Jan stopped on the bank, looking across the water. On the far side stood a single Hungarian border post, dark, silent, untouched. The corporal exhaled. "We made it." Jan didn't move. "Not yet." They crossed slowly, rifles raised, the water cold around their knees. When they reached the far bank, no one spoke. The silence was too heavy, too sacred. They had left their country behind. One of the soldiers whispered, "What now?" Jan stared north toward the burning horizon. "Now we remember who did this." They collapsed on the grass, exhaustion overtaking adrenaline. Some laughed, others cried. The private with freckles stared at the sky, whispering, "We're free." But Jan didn't answer. He was looking at the opposite bank, at the darkness creeping across the land he'd sworn to defend. In the distance, the glow of burning towns stretched endlessly, like a map of hell. As the first light of dawn broke, the Hungarian guards finally emerged, rifles raised, faces unreadable. Their commander approached, scanning the ragged soldiers. "You're Polish?" he asked. Jan nodded. The man's eyes softened. Then welcome, but be warned, Germany has already demanded your surrender. If we shelter you, we risk war ourselves. Jan straightened his back, his voice low but steady. Then tell Berlin, he said, that Poland still fights, even from exile. The Hungarian officer hesitated, then saluted. But as the men were led toward safety, Jan glanced back one last time at the smoking horizon, and deep down he knew the war for Poland had only just begun. They crossed the final checkpoint under a sky the color of iron. The Hungarian soldiers escorted them into a makeshift camp, a few tents, a cooking fire, the faint smell of coffee. For the first time in weeks there was warmth that didn't come from something burning. Jan and his men were ordered to surrender their weapons. The corporal hesitated. Jan nodded once. Do it. He handed over his rifle last, the same one he'd carried since Warsaw. It felt heavier without bullets, like it remembered more than he could bear. The Hungarian officer counted the weapons, then gestured toward the tents. You will stay here, he said. You are not prisoners, but you cannot leave without permission. You will be fed. Rest now. Rest. The word sounded foreign. Inside the tent, the men sat on canvas cots, staring at nothing. For a long time, no one spoke. Then the private with freckles broke the silence. So, it's over? No one answered. Jan removed his cap, setting it on his lap. The silver eagle still gleamed, though dulled by ash. He turned it in his hands like an artifact from another world. The corporal watched him. You don't believe it's over? Jan shook his head. Wars don't end when the fighting stops. They end when the world forgets who started it. Later that night, the Hungarian officer returned. He carried a letter sealed with the Polish crest, smuggled through diplomatic channels. Jan unfolded it under the flickering lamp. It was signed by a colonel from the Eastern Command, one of the last surviving officers. Captain Kowalski, the government has fled to Romania. The army is ordered to withdraw across Allied borders where possible. All remaining units are to disband and regroup abroad under French command. You are to ensure the survival of your men. Poland will rise again through those who endure. Colonel J. Sikorsky. Jan read it twice, then passed it to the corporal. Abroad, the corporal muttered. France, maybe Britain. Another army, another war. Jan looked at him. Would you follow me again? The corporal smiled faintly. We already are. For the first time in days, Jan almost smiled. The next morning, rain turned the camp into a sea of mud, but the men didn't care. They lined up for food, hot soup, thick bread, more than they'd seen in weeks. They ate in silence, steam rising from their bowls like ghosts. After breakfast, a Hungarian medic treated their wounds. When he reached the private with freckles, he whistled softly. You're lucky, he said, wrapping the leg. Half an inch deeper and you'd have lost it. The boy grinned weakly. Half an inch is all I need. Jan stood outside the tent, watching the border road. Convoys of refugees passed every hour, soldiers, civilians, entire families dragging carts through the slush. Each face told the same story, exhaustion mixed with disbelief. The corporal joined him, lighting a cigarette. Think the British will send planes? Jan shook his head. Not for us. Then who? For themselves, eventually. The wind shifted, carrying a faint rumble from the north. Distant explosions, the kind that rolled for miles. Even from here, the war didn't sound finished. That night, a Hungarian lieutenant brought new orders. The Polish soldiers were to be moved deeper inland, away from the border, for processing. Jan read the papers. Processing, the man shrugged. Diplomatic word, safer for you, and for us. Jan gathered his men. We leave at dawn, he said. Keep what you can carry. Where to? The corporal asked. Jan looked south. Toward freedom, or whatever's left of it. They marched again, through mountains now, winding roads lined with frost. The cold bit through their coats, but there was no turning back. Every step south felt like walking through a photograph. The world frozen, silent, waiting for the next explosion. By the third night, they reached a train depot. Dozens of other Polish units were already there, ragged, hungry, eyes hollow but burning with the same stubborn fire. Someone shouted as Jan's group arrived. 10th Brigade? Krakow? Jan nodded. What's left of it? A man stepped forward, an officer in a long coat, medals hidden under mud. Welcome, he said. You're among brothers. They shared stories through the night, tales of last stands, impossible escapes, narrow survivals. Each one ended the same way. We kept fighting because we didn't know how to stop. The next morning, orders came down the line. The soldiers would be transported west, first to France, then to Britain, where a new Polish army was forming under Allied command. Jan looked around at his men. They were thinner now, fewer, but alive. Alive was enough. As the train pulled away from the depot, Jan watched the Hungarian hills fade into mist. He knew they were leaving home behind forever. Then, from somewhere far across Europe, the faint hum of engines reached his ears. Not bombers this time, but something deeper, the sound of war expanding. He turned to the corporal. This isn't escape, he said quietly. It's an intermission. And beyond the horizon, 1940 was already waiting. The train rattled west through the Carpathians, wheels screeching against cold steel, every turn echoing inside the empty cars. The men slept sitting up, rifles now replaced by silence. Their faces were hollow but calm, the look of soldiers who had spent all their fear and had nothing left to lose. Jan stayed awake, standing by the open door, the night wind cutting across his face. Every time the wheels clattered over a rail joint, it sounded like a heartbeat. He couldn't stop hearing Warsaw's sirens, the same pitch, the same rhythm, as if the city still called to him from under the rubble. The corporal joined him, holding a canteen. You should rest. Jan shook his head. Every time I close my eyes, I see fire. Then keep them open, the corporal said, sitting beside him. They rode in silence for a while. Outside, the world blurred into gray streaks, snow beginning to fall, thin and soft, the first of the season. It fell gently, almost politely, as if unaware it was landing on a continent at war. By dawn, they reached a station outside Budapest. Dozens of Polish soldiers already crowded the platforms, hundreds, maybe thousands, streaming in from Romania, Slovakia, everywhere the retreat had led. Uniforms torn, boots broken, but every one of them carried the same stubborn fire. Hungarian guards directed them to the holding camp. A banner hung above the entrance. Transit zone for Allied personnel. Jan read it twice. Allied, he murmured. That's a word that changes meaning fast. Inside, the camp was organized chaos. Polish officers forming queues, nurses patching wounds, scribes copying names. Every tent hummed with languages: Polish, French, English, Hungarian. A chorus of lost nations. An English officer approached, clipboard in hand. Captain Kowalski? Jan nodded. You're to be transported to France within the week. Orders from General Sikorsky himself. Jan blinked. France? Yes, sir. A new Polish army's being raised under Allied command. You'll receive new papers, new uniforms, new everything. You'll be fighting again soon. The corporal smirked. No rest for patriots. Jan didn't smile. Fighting again didn't sound like hope. It sounded like relapse. That night, the men gathered in the mess tent, a patchwork of tarps lit by weak lanterns. Steam rose from tin bowls. Somewhere, someone played an accordion, a broken tune from before the war. The private with freckles leaned across the table. Captain, he said quietly, do you think we'll ever go home? Jan looked at him for a long time before answering. Home isn't a place anymore, he said. It's a promise. The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but wanting to believe. Outside, snow thickened. It fell on tents, rifles, letters, and on the flags stitched to their sleeves. For the first time since the invasion, the world felt still. In the distance, the church bells of Budapest rang midnight. And somewhere far beyond, in London, Paris, and Berlin, men were already drawing the next lines on the map. As Jan lay awake, a courier burst into the tent, breathless, clutching a telegram. He handed it to Jan. The paper trembled in his hands as he read, "France preparing for full-scale defense. Britain requests Polish officers for immediate deployment. Germany mobilizing west." Jan exhaled slowly, the sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh. "They didn't even bury us," he whispered. "They just moved the front." And with that the world turned once more, toward 1940 and toward another storm. The journey to France took 12 days. 12 days of cramped trains, guarded borders, and whispers that the Germans were unstoppable, that Europe itself was shrinking under their boots. Jan's men rode in silence, watching snow turn to rain, then to spring mud as they crossed Austria under false papers. Every checkpoint was a gamble. Every officer could end it all with one question asked too loudly. By the time they reached Paris, the city was alive but uneasy. Lights still glowing, cafes still full, but everyone speaking in lowered tones, as if afraid to wake something sleeping just beyond the horizon. For the Poles, Paris was paradise and guilt all at once. People smiled at them, thanked them, handed them flowers, but Jan couldn't shake the weight of what they'd left behind. The graves, the ruins, the empty country carved between two empires. At the Gare de Lyon, they were met by a French major, tall, thin, and tired. "Welcome, Captain Kowalski," he said in practiced English. "You and your men will report to Coequidan. The Polish army in exile trains there now. Uniforms, weapons, orders, everything you need." The corporal leaned close. "Sir, I thought we were refugees. Turns out we're soldiers again." Jan looked at him. "We never stopped being soldiers." Coequidan, Brittany. Weeks later. Rain again. Always rain. The camp sat among pines and mud, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 disbanded armies, Czech, Norwegian, Dutch, and now Polish. Jan drilled his men daily, marches, firing drills, formations. Routine was the only thing keeping them from collapse. At night, they talked by lantern light, whispering about families left behind, letters never sent, dreams they didn't trust enough to speak aloud. The private with freckles, now thinner but still alive, showed Jan a photograph, his mother in front of a small grocery in Krakow. "I keep thinking," he said softly, "if she's still there, maybe she still thinks I'll come home." Jan studied the picture. "Then you owe it to her to keep fighting." The boy nodded. "Do you think Poland will rise again?" Jan looked at the wet horizon. "If we don't, it won't." In May 1940, the sky changed again. Not the weather, but the war. German panzers tore through the Ardennes, crushing the Maginot Line from behind. France, invincible on paper, began to crumble in days. At Coequidan, the Polish officers gathered in the mess hall as a French radio broadcast stammered through the news. Sedan, breakthrough confirmed, Paris under threat. The room fell silent. The corporal whispered, "Not again." Jan felt the same dread he'd felt in Warsaw. That first siren, that helplessness of watching everything fall too fast to stop. He slammed his fist on the table. "We fight this time. No retreat." The next morning, their orders came. The 10th Armored Cavalry Brigade was to move north, reinforce the collapsing French lines near the Somme. Jan looked at his men, now wearing fresh uniforms but the same eyes as before. "France is not Poland," he said. "We're not defending home this time. But maybe if we hold the line, someone else keeps theirs." They boarded trucks, old Renaults that coughed smoke and rattled like bones. Rain fell harder now, as if the sky itself was trying to wash the world clean of mistakes. The road north was chaos. Refugees again, carts, soldiers marching backward instead of forward. The same scene, just a different language. When they reached the front, they saw it. The fields of France burning, villages flattened, the same gray bombers carving black scars into the air. It was Poland all over again, only this time they were ready. Jan climbed into a French tank, a Saumur S-35, foreign steel, familiar noise. He ran his gloved hand along the interior, whispering, "If you hold, maybe the world does too." Then came the radio call, a panicked French voice screaming through static. German armor, multiple divisions, approaching Arras. The line is broken. Jan grabbed the transmitter. Not here it isn't. He turned to his crew. Start the engine. The tank roared to life, and once again Jan Kowalski, a captain of a country that no longer existed, drove straight into another country's war. They met the enemy near Arras. It wasn't a battle at first, just a storm breaking. German artillery thundered across the plain, flattening hedgerows, barns, whole villages in minutes. The French lines splintered like glass. Jan's brigade arrived into chaos, civilians running one way, soldiers another. Orders changed faster than they could be received. Radios crackled with panic. Hold the crossroad, came the command. The crossroad was already gone. Jan's tank rolled into position anyway, metal groaning, treads chewing through mud and corpses alike. The air was thick with cordite and rain, every breath a mix of smoke and fear. Through the periscope he saw it, panzers, black silhouettes against lightning flashes, moving with mechanical certainty. He gritted his teeth. Load armor piercing. The gunner nodded. A shell slid into the breach with a metallic hiss. Ready. Fire. The shot hit the lead panzer square in the turret. Flames erupted, painting the rain orange. The crew cheered. Then 3 more German tanks appeared through the smoke. Jan didn't blink. Again. The French units nearby broke and ran. His Poles didn't. They fought in mud up to their knees, machine guns overheating, grenades slick with rain, rifles clutched like prayer books. A French lieutenant stumbled past, shouting, It's hopeless! They've broken through everywhere! Jan grabbed him by the collar. Not here! He shoved him toward a ditch. If you can't fight, then hide. We'll buy you an hour. That hour turned into 5. By dusk, the field was a furnace. Tanks burning, shells bursting, the smell of oil and flesh everywhere. The corporal crawled into Jan's tank, face black with soot. Sir, we're out of shells. Then we use what's left. He grabbed his sidearm, wiped rain from his eyes, and climbed out into the open. German infantry were advancing now, bayonets glinting under flashes of lightning. He raised his pistol and fired until the slide locked empty. Then he threw it down and picked up a rifle from the mud. Each shot was deliberate, each breath a vow. The private with freckles was beside him, reloading by instinct. When a mortar exploded nearby, it threw both men into the ditch. The boy groaned, clutching his leg. Jan pressed a hand over the wound, hot blood, pulsing. You'll live. The boy's voice was small. Promise? Jan met his eyes. I don't make promises anymore. Night fell, but the sky didn't darken. The fires were too bright. From the ridge, they watched what was left of Arras vanish beneath smoke. Of the 100 men Jan had led into France, 20 still stood. He counted them one by one, memorizing faces he knew would soon blur into memory. The corporal lit a cigarette with shaking hands. We can't hold forever, sir. Jan looked west. We don't have to, just long enough. For what? For the others to run. He didn't mean France. He meant time. Time itself, slipping like sand through fingers. At dawn, new orders came. Retreat toward Dunkirk. Evacuation in progress. The corporal frowned. Evacuation? Jan exhaled. So this is how it ends. They climbed back into what remained of their tanks. Engines sputtered, coughed, roared back to life. The rain washed the ash from their faces, but not the war from their eyes. They drove east, the wrong direction, covering the withdrawal of the British and French. Every mile they held was a mile someone else survived. By the 3rd day, fuel was gone, ammunition nearly empty. Jan's tank broke down outside a village near Saint-Omer. As he climbed out, he saw something impossible through the smoke. British destroyers offshore, silhouettes in the dawn, boats landing on the beaches, men running for the sea. The evacuation had begun, and he realized, and they weren't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to escape history alive. The road to Dunkirk was a graveyard of steel. Abandoned trucks smoldered in the ditches. Tanks without turrets lay half buried in the sand, their crews already ghosts. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and gasoline. Jan's remaining men moved on foot now, boots blistered. faces streaked with soot. Every few miles, a German plane screamed overhead, strafing the columns. Each time, the men dropped flat into the mud and waited for silence. By the fifth raid, no one flinched anymore. They reached the dunes at sunset. The sea stretched out before them, gray, endless, and full of ships. Destroyers, fishing boats, ferries, anything that could float. Lines of men snaked down to the water's edge, waiting for rescue. Jan stopped at the crest of a dune, staring. The horizon was burning. The channel itself seemed to smoke. "Dear God," the corporal whispered. "It's the whole army." British soldiers moved among the queues, shouting names, orders, destinations. The beach was chaos, discipline drowned in exhaustion. Jan approached a British officer directing traffic. "Polish unit, 10th Brigade," he said. "We've fought at Arras." The man blinked, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "Arras? You made it out?" "Barely." The officer pointed toward a cluster of landing boats. "Get your men down there. We're pulling out by dawn." The night fell thick and restless. Thousands huddled on the beach, the surf licking at their boots, the sky pulsing with red from the fires inland. Every few minutes, bombs whistled overhead. Each one sent a ripple through the crowd, heads ducking, teeth clenched. Then silence again, broken only by the waves. Jan sat in the sand, rifle across his knees, watching the horizon. The corporal joined him, handing over half a biscuit. "Last one," he said. Jan broke it in two and handed half back. They ate in silence, chewing slowly, as if the moment might last longer if they moved gently. The private with freckles sat nearby, shivering under a torn blanket. "Do you think we'll get across?" he asked. Jan nodded once. "We'll get across." "And after that?" "After that, we start again." The boy frowned. "How many times can we start over?" Jan looked at the waves. "As many as it takes." Just before dawn, a British corporal shouted for boarding. The men rose, gathering their few belongings. The tide was high, the air sharp with diesel and smoke. As they neared the boats, German bombers appeared out of the mist, black crosses etched against a pale sky. Sirens screamed, men scattered, sand erupted under machine gun fire. Jan threw himself over the private, shielding him as explosions tore the beach apart. When the dust cleared, half the line was gone. The corporal's voice cut through the chaos. "Captain, over here!" He was waving from a landing craft, half filled already with British and French troops. Jan grabbed the private's arm and ran. They splashed into the surf, waves hitting like hammers. A bullet whipped past, grazing his shoulder. He barely felt it. Hands pulled them aboard. The engine roared. The boat turned toward the open sea. From the deck, Jan looked back at the shore, a blur of smoke, flame, and men still waiting. It looked just like Warsaw, just like everywhere. He clenched the railing until his knuckles went white. As the boat cut through the waves, a voice crackled over the ship's radio. "France collapsing. Paris expected to fall. Prepare for redeployment to Britain." The corporal looked at Jan. "We're going to fight again, aren't we?" Jan didn't answer. He just stared toward the horizon, where the sun was rising through the smoke, and whispered, "We never stopped." The sea was gray and endless. The evacuation ships rocked under the weight of too many souls. Soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder, faces blank with exhaustion. The air smelled of salt, oil, and smoke. Jan leaned against the railing, his coat stiff with dried seawater. Behind him, the corporal sat on a crate, wrapping a bandage around his forearm. "You realize," he said, "we've survived 2 invasions, 3 retreats, and a miracle." Jan stared at the horizon. It wasn't a miracle. It was madness that worked once. The boy with freckles limped over, his face pale but determined. "Captain, the English sailors say we'll reach Dover in 4 hours. Jan nodded. "Then, for 4 hours, we're free men." The boy smiled faintly. "Feels strange." "What does?" "Being alive." He walked away, leaving Jan with the sound of waves and distant thunder. A thunder that wasn't weather. Somewhere behind them, France was still burning. When they reached Dover, the docks were chaos. Thousands arriving by the hour, uniforms drenched, faces hollow. The British nurses handed out tea and blankets. The Salvation Army sang hymns that nobody listened to. Jan's men followed signs to a field camp on the cliffs above the harbor. For the first time in months, the air didn't smell like gunpowder, only rain and earth. A British officer greeted them at the gate. "Captain Kowalski?" "Yes." "Welcome to England. You'll be reassigned under Allied command once you're cleared. Your men will get food and rest." Jan looked around. Hundreds of tents, rows of exhausted soldiers. He felt both relief and guilt. Survival always carried both. "Thank you," he said quietly. Inside the tent, his men slept instantly, sprawled across the floor, boots still on. The corporal lay on his back, eyes open. "Feels wrong, doesn't it?" "What does?" Jan asked. "Sleeping under a roof." Jan smirked. "Enjoy it while you can." He stepped outside into the night. The white cliffs glowed under the moon, the channel behind them dark and silent now. He could see faint flashes on the horizon. France still fighting, still falling. He took a deep breath of the cold air. For the first time in weeks, he let himself feel something close to calm. Then footsteps approached. A British officer in a long coat handed him an envelope. "Orders from London," he said. Jan broke the seal. "To all officers of the Polish armed forces now on British soil, a new Polish army is to be formed under Allied supervision. Report to your assigned training facility within 48 hours. The fight for Europe continues." He folded the letter slowly. No rest after all. 2 days later, Jan's unit boarded another train, this time north, through rolling green fields untouched by war. Villagers waved at them as they passed, shouting blessings in English he barely understood. It was the first time he'd seen civilians smiling since 1939. The corporal leaned out the window. "They think we're heroes." Jan's gaze stayed on the fields. "They think we're proof it can't happen here." At the new camp in Scotland, they found other Poles, thousands more who'd made it out through Romania, through Norway, through hell itself. Each man wore a different patch, a different wound, but the same expression: weary defiance. Training resumed. Rifles cracked across the moors. Engines roared in hangars. Maps of Europe covered every wall. Poland was gone from those maps, replaced by gray lines and foreign words. But every soldier still called it home. One night Jan stood alone by the fence, wind cutting across the field. The corporal joined him, lighting a cigarette. "You ever think we'll go back?" Jan stared into the darkness. "We'll go back, one day, but not as soldiers." The corporal frowned. "Then how?" "As ghosts," Jan said quietly. "That's what wars make of men like us." He turned toward the horizon, where thunder rolled again. Not storms this time, but engines. The British Spitfires were taking off from a nearby airfield, rising into the night sky. The next war had already begun, and this time the skies would burn first. Morning over the Scottish Highlands came cold and blue. Mist hung over the training fields like smoke that refused to leave. The sound of aircraft engines hummed above the clouds, constant, rhythmic, mechanical. It never stopped anymore. Jan's men stood in formation, uniforms stiff with new patches, the Polish 1st Armored Division, reborn under British command. Different country, same cause, a flag stitched from memory. The corporal stood beside him, his hair newly cut, his boots polished but scuffed at the edges. "Never thought we'd look like soldiers again," he said. Jan gave a small nod. "Appearances deceive. We just learned to wear our ghosts better." They trained relentlessly. British instructors shouted orders in clipped tones. Tanks rolled over the moors, leaving black scars in the grass. Rain fell sideways, stinging eyes, soaking uniforms. But nobody complained. It felt good to hurt for something again. At night they gathered in the mess tent. Maps spread across tables, radios crackling with news from the continent. France had fallen. The Low Countries were gone. Now the Luftwaffe bombed London nightly. The world had grown smaller, an island and its stubborn allies holding the line against the dark. One evening, Jan was summoned to headquarters. The commander, a British colonel with silver hair and eyes that looked permanently tired, handed him a file. "Captain Kowalski," he said, "your unit has been selected for advanced armor integration. You'll train with our new tanks. Prepare for cross-channel operations when the time comes." Jan flipped through the papers. Diagrams of Shermans, maps of southern England, timetables marked classified. "When will that be?" "When the tide turns," the colonel said quietly. "It always does." The following weeks blurred into motion. Drills, briefings, mechanical repairs, endless rain. Every day, Jan felt the world edging closer to something enormous, inevitable. Rumors spread like smoke. The Americans are joining. There will be an invasion. Europe will rise again. In the barracks, the men spoke less of Poland now and more of revenge. The private with freckles, limping but unbroken, asked Jan one night, "Do you think the Germans ever think about what they did to us?" Jan stared at the lamp flame. "Only in the quiet hours. That's when ghosts whisper loudest." The boy nodded slowly. "Then I hope they never sleep." By spring of 1941, the Polish forces were integrated into Allied command. They wore British helmets now, drove British tanks, carried British rifles. But under their collars, most still pinned small silver eagles, hidden but undefeated. Jan's men had become known for precision. British officers called them the Iron Ones, never loud, never careless, always the last to leave a field. They took pride in that. Pain turned into discipline, loss into momentum. One afternoon during a tank exercise on the moors, the radio picked up a London broadcast. Churchill's voice, deep, deliberate, unshakable, filled the air. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." The men stopped what they were doing. Engines idled. For a brief moment, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jan stood atop his tank, listening. The words reached him like an echo from the future, something solid in a world that kept falling apart. He whispered, "Then neither will we." That night, a British courier arrived with sealed orders. Jan broke the wax and read by lantern light. Polish 1st Armored Division to prepare for deployment to southern England. Reinforcement to be completed by spring 1944. Objective, Western Europe. The corporal whistled softly. 3 years to wait. Jan folded the letter. 3 years to prepare. He looked at his men, asleep in their bunks, boots lined like gravestones, and felt something he hadn't in a long time. Purpose. Outside, thunder rolled again, not from storms, but from the distant rumble of engines gathering in the night. Jan stepped into the cold air, staring south toward the invisible sea. He could almost feel it, the pull of a new dawn, the whisper of revenge carried on salt wind. The war wasn't done with him yet, and he wasn't done with it. The war had settled into a strange rhythm, distant, grinding, endless. Every sunrise brought new reports, new fronts, new losses measured in cities instead of men. But in the quiet corners of Britain, armies were being rebuilt, piece by piece, heartbeat by heartbeat. Jan's division trained on the southern coast now. Rows of tanks lined the cliffs, their barrels pointing toward the sea, as if waiting for permission to cross it. Each morning began with engines, drills, and the smell of fuel, the perfume of purpose. The corporal had grown leaner, his face harder. 2 years of training, he said one morning, tossing a wrench into a crate. Feels like we've been frozen in time. Jan wiped grease from his hands. Better frozen than buried. They had grown used to the British countryside, the fog, the polite voices, the rationed cigarettes. But no matter how far from Poland they stood, the same weight pressed on them. Every drill, every meal, every night under canvas was just waiting for one word: go. In the evenings they gathered by the barracks stove, drinking weak tea and reading newspapers weeks out of date. Headlines spoke of Africa, Stalingrad, Midway. The world was tearing itself apart in every direction. The private with freckles, now 19, traced a map with his finger. "The Russians are pushing back," he said. "If they keep going, they'll reach Poland first." Jan's gaze darkened. "Then we'll find what's left." The boy hesitated. "And if there's nothing left?" "Then we rebuild it from memory," Jan said. A coded message arrived at headquarters. "Operation Overlord confirmed. Stand by for mobilization." No date, no details. Just the weight of inevitability. That night the men couldn't sleep. They cleaned weapons that didn't need cleaning, repacked bags that were already perfect. They all knew what it meant. The invasion of Europe. Their chance to go back, to make history remember Poland again. Jan walked the camp alone under a moon veiled by mist. He stopped at the fence, looking out over the cliffs where the channel shimmered silver. In his pocket he carried a small photograph of his wife, Helena, creased, faded, saved through every retreat. He whispered to it, "I'm coming home, one way or another." Weeks later, they were moved to Portsmouth, a city humming with secrets. Ships filled the harbor, planes roared overhead. Every dock was alive with crates, fuel drums, and the low murmur of languages from half the world. The corporal looked around. "This isn't training anymore." Jan nodded. "No, it's a countdown." Their tanks were repainted, white stripes on olive steel, invasion markings. Crews practiced loading onto landing craft under blackout conditions. Every night, the horizon glowed faintly with the war waiting to be unleashed. Then, one morning in June, a single sheet of paper appeared on every cot. No speeches, no ceremony, just an order. "Tomorrow." The men read it in silence. The corporal folded his copy carefully like a prayer. "After all this time," he said. Jan looked at him. "We waited 4 years for one word." He smiled grimly. "Let's make it worth it." That night Jan couldn't sleep. He sat on the pier, watching the moonlight ripple across the water. The air smelled of oil and rain. He thought of the bridge at Piaseczno, the boy waving a flag before his father pulled him inside, the sirens over Warsaw. He could still hear them. He always would. The corporal joined him quietly, lighting a cigarette. "You think we'll make it back?" Jan took the cigarette, drew in smoke, exhaled slow. "We already did once." The corporal nodded. "Not all of us." Jan stared at the sea. "Then we go for them too." Far out on the horizon, thunder rolled again, not from the sky, but from hundreds of engines starting at once. Ships, tanks, men. The invasion was no longer a rumor. It was rising with the tide. June 5th, 1944. The world held its breath. Under a pale moon, the southern ports of England hummed like a single living machine. Engines rumbled, chains clanked, steel groaned beneath the weight of history about to move. And among the countless divisions preparing to cross the channel, Jan's men waited, silent, armed, and unflinching. Each man carried a small slip of paper tucked in his pocket. In case of death, notify next of kin. No one spoke about it. Everyone had read theirs. The corporal checked his watch. "This is it." Jan nodded, his eyes on the horizon, a darkness waiting to be broken by fire. "After 5 years," he said, "we're finally going the other way." The order came down just before midnight. Operation Overlord. Execute. At dawn, the sea erupted. Thousands of ships surged toward France. Destroyers, landing craft, tank carriers, all moving through fog and gunfire. The water churned black beneath the sky, streaked with tracer rounds. Inside his landing craft, Jan stood shoulder to shoulder with his men, faces pale, helmets dripping seawater, hearts pounding in unison. Someone began to pray in Polish. Others joined, low voices blending with the thunder of engines. The corporal leaned close. "You ever think we'd see this day?" Jan's reply was steady. "I thought we'd die waiting for it." The ramp dropped. Machine gun fire tore through the mist. Men fell before they touched the sand. Jan shouted, "Forward!" and ran through the surf, bullets snapping past his head. They hit the beach under hellfire. Explosions churned sand into smoke. Shouts, screams, and commands blurred together until all that existed was movement. Forward, always forward. Jan dove behind a steel obstacle, waves crashing over him. The corporal slid in beside him, gasping. "Everything's gone wrong," he yelled. Jan reloaded calmly. "Everything always does. Keep moving." They crawled, sprinted, stumbled up the slope. Every foot a victory. When they reached the first line of dunes, Jan turned back, saw the sea filled with ships, men, smoke, and fire stretching to the horizon. It looked like the earth itself was bleeding. By noon, they'd pushed inland. The beachhead was secured, barely. Bodies lay tangled in wire, uniforms indistinguishable from mud. The private with freckles limped past, helping another soldier. His face was streaked with grime, but alive. Jan stood beside a wrecked bunker, catching his breath. He'd fought for 5 nations, across 2 continents, through defeat and exile, and somehow he was back on European soil again. Not as a refugee this time, as an answer. The corporal came up beside him, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "You realize, sir," he said quietly, "we're fighting on the same continent we left in chains." Jan looked toward the burning horizon. "Then let's make sure we don't leave it that way again." That night, as they camped amid the ruins, a runner arrived from headquarters, mud-covered, breathless. He handed Jan a note scrawled in pencil. "Polish units ordered east. Objective Caen. Heavy resistance expected." The corporal frowned. "East again, always east." Jan folded the note. "Because that's where home used to be." And in the distance the guns began again, steady, relentless, calling them forward. The road to Caen was a wound carved through Normandy. Every mile was mud, smoke, and shattered villages. The hedgerows hid snipers, the fields hid mines, and the sky hid death. Jan's armored column rolled forward slowly, tanks grinding through narrow lanes walled with earth and stone. The smell of burning wheat hung thick, sweet, sick, unforgettable. "Keep distance between vehicles," he shouted. The men obeyed without hesitation. After years of running, they had learned that caution was a luxury they couldn't afford to forget. They passed villagers emerging from cellars, hollow-eyed, clutching children, waving small flags. "Polonaise?" one woman cried, touching her heart. Jan nodded, offering what little comfort he could. "Yes, we're here." The corporal muttered, "Feels strange being called liberators." Jan's eyes stayed forward. "Because we haven't been liberated ourselves." Outside the town of Bretteville, they met resistance, German armor, dug in behind hedgerows. Mortar fire rained from unseen positions. The first shell struck the lead tank, flipping it on its side. The explosion echoed through the valley. Jan's voice cut through the chaos. "Smoke cover! Move up!" The Polish tanks fanned out, firing through gaps in the hedges. Each shot was a flash of defiance. When their shells ran low, infantry advanced on foot. Close combat, brutal and personal. The corporal fought beside Jan, both firing until their rifles clicked empty. A grenade landed nearby. Jan kicked it into a ditch a second before it detonated. The blast lifted him off his feet and slammed him into a wall. His ears rang. The world blurred. When he blinked, he saw the corporal dragging him behind a wreck. "You still with me, sir?" Jan spat blood, nodded. "I'll die when it's inconvenient, not before." They pressed forward again, clearing house by house, barn by barn. By nightfall, the field was theirs. What was left of it? Smoke curled into a crimson sky. The men sat among the ruins, drinking water that tasted like metal, silent except for the crackle of fire. The private with freckles limped over. "We took the ridge," he said, "but the lieutenant didn't make it." Jan closed his eyes. "Then we hold it for him." The next morning, orders came through. Push toward Caen. No retreat, no delay. Jan studied the map. The town was a ruin already, flattened by days of bombing. But the Germans still held the bridges, and whoever held the bridges controlled the road east. He looked up at his men, thinner, dirtier, but unbroken. "This is it," he said. "We finish what started in 1939. The corporal smirked. "Took us 5 years to march a few hundred miles." Jan smiled back. We've walked through hell to get here. They rolled out at dawn. Engines growled. The road shimmered with heat and smoke. As they neared Caen, the sound of battle grew louder. Tanks clashing, aircraft roaring overhead, the ground shaking like the heart of the world. They fought all day, pushing through rubble and fire. By dusk, the last German defense crumbled. Caen was theirs. What remained of it? Jan stood on a balcony overlooking the shattered city. The wind carried the smell of dust and victory, both equally hollow. He reached into his pocket, pulled out Helena's photograph, and stared at it for a long time. "We're coming home," he whispered, slowly, one city at a time. That night, a courier arrived from headquarters. His uniform scorched, his face pale. He handed Jan a telegram marked urgent. Jan read it once, then again, slower. Warsaw uprising, Polish resistance fighting Germans, civilians armed, heavy casualties, city surrounded. The paper trembled in his hand. He looked north, as if he could see through the darkness, across countries, across time, and whispered, "They're still fighting." The corporal's voice was barely audible. "Then so are we." August 1944. The summer air in Normandy was thick with dust and triumph, but Jan couldn't taste either. The telegram still burned in his pocket, the news from Warsaw, every line a blade. He sat alone by the tank, boots caked with dirt, hands shaking. Around him, men celebrated in the distance, shouting, laughing, alive. But he felt none of it. He was hearing different gunfire, far away, in the streets where he'd been born. The corporal approached quietly, a tin of coffee in one hand. "Any word?" Jan shook his head. "The Germans are destroying the city, the Soviets. They're watching from the river." He looked up, eyes hollow. "They're letting it die." The corporal set the tin beside him. "Then we don't let them die for nothing." Jan nodded slowly. "No, we don't." The Polish division pushed east with the Allies, through France, through Belgium, through the shattered bones of Europe. Every town liberated brought cheers, flags waving, bells ringing, but for Jan, every victory was another reminder of the one city still burning without help. In September, they reached the Dutch border. Rain fell hard, turning the roads to rivers of mud. Tanks bogged down, engines drowned, but they kept moving. At night, Jan studied maps by candlelight, tracing lines toward Poland, though no orders pointed that way. One evening, the private with freckles joined him. His limp was worse now, but his eyes were bright. "Captain," he said, "I heard the BBC. The uprising's over." Jan looked up slowly. "Over?" The boy nodded. "They said the city's gone." Jan stared at the map. His finger hovered over the word Warsaw printed in faded ink. Gone. He closed the map. "Then we fight for what's left of its memory." By winter, the snow returned. They advanced into Germany, shattered villages, frozen rivers, forests where silence felt heavier than gunfire. In a ruined farmhouse near Aachen, Jan's men built a small fire. The corporal poured hot water into a dented kettle. 5 years, he said. 5 winters of this. Jan smiled faintly. Maybe this one ends it. Do you believe that? He looked into the flames. I have to. Outside, artillery thundered. Steady, distant, final. The end of something enormous, moving closer each day. April 1945. They reached the Elbe. The sky was red at sunset. Not from fire this time, but from relief. News spread through the camps. Berlin surrounded. Hitler finished. The war ending. But the joy felt muted. Too many ghosts standing between them and peace. That night, Jan walked down to the riverbank alone. He took off his cap and stared into the water, dark, cold, endless. In the reflection, he saw every man he'd lost, every promise he'd made, every home he'd left behind. The corporal found him there, silent as ever. Orders came in, he said softly. Ceasefire tomorrow. Jan didn't move. Tomorrow, he repeated, as if testing the word. The corporal hesitated. "You going to sleep, sir?" Jan shook his head. "Not tonight. Not after 5 years awake." When dawn came, the guns fell quiet. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Too vast, too sudden, like the world had forgotten how to breathe. Jan stood by the tank, helmet under his arm, watching smoke drift lazily over the fields. Around him the men waited, uncertain. No orders, no enemies, no sound but the wind. The private with freckles approached, limping as always. "It's over," he said. Jan looked at him, a small, tired smile breaking through. "Yes," he said, "but we're still here." He turned to his men, what remained of them, and raised his voice. "5 years ago, they buried us in the ruins of Poland. We were supposed to disappear. But look at us now." He paused, his voice catching. "We fought for every inch of the world that forgot us, and somehow we lived long enough to see it remember." The men stood in silence. Some saluted, some wept. Jan put his cap back on, straightened his uniform, and looked east. The smoke in the distance was fading into morning light. "Let's go home," he said quietly. And though none of them knew where that was anymore, they followed him anyway, because home wasn't a place. It was the direction they refused to stop walking toward. Years later, historians would call it the day the world went to war. But for the men who lived it, and for one captain who never stopped walking east, it was simply the day the world learned how long courage can last.